Well, I'd like to welcome everybody here this evening. My name is Justin Fout. I serve as principal of Immaculata Classical Academy. For those of you that don't know, Immaculata, we are Catholic, we're classical, we're inclusive school, serving students from preschool age through 12th grade, right here in Louisville, Kentucky. Our address, we're over on Preston Highway, 6010 Preston Highway, connected to Guardian Angels Catholic Church. This speaker series, we did one a couple years back. We are resurrecting it. And this is the first of many. There's a save the date over on these tables back in the back there. We have lots of good speakers, about 3 or 4 good speakers lined up for the rest of this year. So please take a save the date, mark your calendar. Tonight is the first of many good talks. Tonight's my privilege to introduce our speaker for this evening. Dr. William Fahey hails from New England, married with 5 children, currently serves as the president of Thomas More College of Liberal Arts. He was educated at St. Andrew's Academy in Scotland, also the Catholic University of America in D.C. He's an accomplished classicist. He's a national and an international speaker. He's published articles, essays, and reviews, too many to mention, including an article about our very own Wendell Berry, Kentucky's Wendell Berry, if you're familiar with him. Also, I've talked to his students, talked to people that worked with him. At his very heart, he is a teacher. And I know tonight he'll teach us many great things about what education is, how it involves truth, civilization. It'll be a great talk. Without further ado, let's give a warm welcome to Dr. William Fahey.
Thank you. We say Mr. or Principal Fout?
Either one works.
What do the students say? Mr. Thank you, Mr. Fout. If I speak at this tone, can everyone hear me? Do I need to be closer, further? How's that? Closer? Louder? So I'm very pleased to be here. This is probably the 10th time I've come to Kentucky in the last 10 years. And I tell myself every time I come, now granted I'm usually out in Bardstown, that if everything goes bad for me, I'm going to come to Kentucky. I don't quite know what it is. Part of it's the landscape, a lot of it is the people. It seems to be exactly what its history suggests it is, which is a nice mixture of the parts of America that I really like, the Midwest, the South, and even elements of the East. Now I'm honored to be, I take it I'm the first in the Resurrected Speaker Series. Okay, that reminds me of what was said to our Lord when he said, "Pull back the rock." It's been 3 days, it stinketh. So I'm hoping that won't be your reaction to my talk. One thing that Mr. Fout didn't say was that I'm coming out of a very intense review at my college, and also coming out of a household. Some of you I know travel. So right now I'm on the road with a household where just about everyone is sick, and I've received several texts from my wife who's sick saying, "I hope you're having a very good time in Kentucky." And I'm sure many of you know what that's code for. Right before I came in the room, one of my former students said, "So how do you prepare when you speak to audiences?" And I said, I don't really know what you mean. I just go in and speak. And I'm not so sure about this one. And he said, "Well, what do you mean? Haven't you delivered this talk many times?" This is another thing I'd like you to know. I never give the same talk twice. I can't stand it. I find myself boring enough. I don't want to listen to myself more than once. So every talk I actually do prepare for the group that invites me. And Mr. Fout asked me to speak on the liberal arts, and I spent a good deal of time thinking about the liberal arts. So the talk I put together really is my thinking of mostly today in Bardstown, Kentucky, about the state of liberal arts in the United States. And I hope that you hear something you can take away that's interesting. But I'm very mindful of what President Reagan said about a good evening talk. And that was, a good evening talk is a talk that allows me to get home comfortably to go to bed. Now, he said 9 o'clock, but, well, it's 7:20. I don't think I'm going to push till 9. But I'm going to be mindful of the clock and the time. But I don't like surprises in talks. So I'm just going to tell you right now what I'm going to say very briefly. I won't have any problems if you decide to recharge your glass and just keep drinking, because you already know what my talk's about. All right? So I'm basically going to say our country is in bad shape. Part of the problem stems from a misunderstanding of what the liberal arts means. And that if we hope to have a country that's in better shape, that we better get our act together and get behind real institutions that put forward true liberal arts curricula, like Immaculata, like my college, and a number of other institutions, but not too many, sadly, in the United States. So the gist of it is, as the talk says, wouldn't it be wonderful if we had a country where when we thought of education, what we thought of was truth? If we did, our country and the world would be in better shape than it is now. There. Now you can head to the bar and charge your glasses. I also hate technology, as all my students know, so I'm a little bit, if I fade in and out, just say louder. I don't mind being told what to do. In fact, I kind of like it in environments like this. So let's begin. In the past 10 days since the election of Donald Trump, there have been protests throughout the United States, in cities, on both coasts, in the middle of the country, in the South, and especially on college campuses. And although there's evidence that these protests are orchestrated or at least partially controlled and financed by organizations like Planned Parenthood outside of the city or outside of the university context, the reality is, in the last 10 days, that the campus reaction to the election has been fairly spontaneous, fairly consistent all throughout the United States. And if you haven't seen what's happened or heard about what's happened, classes and midterm examinations were canceled all over the place, hundreds of colleges and universities on the day after the election. Colleges deployed therapy dogs to be stroked by distraught teachers and students. It wasn't just the students. Administrations held meetings where hot chocolate and other comfort foods were doled out. I can see the students over there smiling, thinking, that's not so bad. Campus medical centers provided aromatherapy and other therapeutic measures to deal with the post-election stress. Students had cry sessions and other measures to deal with post-election stress. And I suppose if they haven't started already, we'll be talking about PES or something like that, dealing with post-election stress. Coloring books were distributed, and eventually crowds were mustered into "Not My President" and "Safe Campus" protests. And really, there's not any sign that this is decreasing. I've monitored over the last 10 days, and the number of protests is increasing, and the number of sites is increasing. Now, I think initially people thought these stories were just funny or fake, but they're real, and the protests and the infantile behavior continues. And frankly, the Trump election merely exposes what's been normative in higher education for years. For several years now, at a mid-sized Catholic college near my own, there are nap pods and therapy dogs and safe spaces. A safe space is an area where it's labeled, no one can say any trigger words. They cannot say anything that would disturb you. And as I say, dogs and other furry creatures appear during exam week. This seems to be increasingly a common feature in colleges throughout the United States. And it's not just the United States. I looked into this, and the thin-skinned and visceral response to any trauma that a student might encounter by bumping into an idea that is not his own exists outside the United States. I was very surprised to see in 2014 at Oxford, at Christ Church College, Oxford, there was going to be a debate. Now, this was a debate. They invited two speakers from the outside. The debate was on a motion. The motion was, this House believes that abortion hurts us all, or hurts the culture of Great Britain. There was one pro-choice speaker, one pro-life speaker. Oxford University shut this down because they were afraid that students would be mentally harmed by what they heard in the debate. And furthermore, the Oxford feminists pointed out that two cisgendered individuals had nothing to say on this issue. So to teach you a new word, here's one little takeaway. Does anyone in this room know what cisgender means?
Not transgender.
There we go, not transgender. So cisgender is usually code for men. What did two men have to say about the life issue? As someone in higher education, I can assure you that this reaction has been long in the making. For 30 or 40 years, students have been increasingly taught to identify trigger words, anything that might alarm them or make them feel uncomfortable, and to look at this as some sort of crime. And most student handbooks, you can get online, most student handbooks are online, and you can look up their policies on hate crime. Now, hatred is a very nasty thing. It's also part of life to deal with hatred. I don't know of any pro-hatred party out there. But the problem is that universities are waging this war against hatred, which is largely defined as anything that disturbs you. Again, if you look at student handbooks, I don't want to name names, but I'll take a passage from a very well-known East Coast college. And in their student handbook, they have a section on hate crime, or as it's now being described, a bias incident. Hate crime's a little bit too firm. A biased incident is the new expression. A bias incident, to quote the handbook, a bias incident is an event, behavior, or action which is personally directed against or targets an individual or group based on perceived or actual characteristics such as race, ethnicity, sex, gender, identity, expression, religion, sexual orientation, national origin, physical or mental disability, age, or military veteran status. Now, I find this hilarious because this code on bias incidents on all those issues comes from a college whose motto is a place to think. A place to think. Right down the road, there's another college which describes hate crimes or bias incidents as an event where a person intentionally commits the act or acts constituting the offense in whole or in substantial part because of a belief or perception regarding the race, color, national origin, ancestry, gender, religion, religious practice, age, disability, or sexual orientation of a person, regardless of whether the belief or the perception is correct. It doesn't specify whether it's the belief or perception of the accused or the accuser, but regardless of whether it's correct. What exactly can we talk about at universities when talking about our fellow man if we have to exclude potentially offensive thoughts, events, behaviors, or actions which deal with questions of race, ethnicity, sex, gender expression, religion, national orientation, etc.? Well, if you made a list, here are the following things that you can't talk about at a university, at liberal arts universities, because they might cause hate or bias. You can't talk about love. You can't talk about spirituality, war, friendship, law, politics, culture, religion, romance, aging, sin, death, heaven, hell, judgment, etc. Anything that's actually interesting to talk about and has constituted the conversation of civilization for several thousand years is potentially a bias incident, and you can't speak about it. So we're facing a colossal problem unless we live in a society where everyone agrees. Now, in fact, we're getting to the point where at universities, people by and large agree. So polls last week of voting patterns and political affiliations indicate that at American universities, 75 to 95%, depending on the university, 75 to 90% of the students and faculty of universities in the United States identify themselves as progressives or liberals. So we're moving to a situation where our institutions of higher education, which are supposed to be about debate and ideas and struggling with difficult matters, are places of conformity where everyone does agree, and measures are being taken to make sure that there's nothing that can contradict what the majority think. Now, this is troubling to me as a college president because fragile and irrational behavior is manifesting itself exactly where there should be learning, debate, and thinking. In fact, most of this childish or increasingly lawless behavior during the last week has occurred at the very institutions or is sponsored by the very institutions that call themselves liberal arts colleges. Now, Mr. Fout's getting very nervous because so far I'm providing a very good argument for why you should run if you hear the word liberal arts. Now, I'll return later to whether these places are, in fact, liberal arts colleges or universities. You can anticipate what I'm going to say. But the fact remains that the very spot that most of us think that a young person should find his time for and space for final maturation before entering into the adult world, that these very places are producing jittery, unthinking, short-tempered cowards. And I say cowards because I think that's principally what we see absent on colleges and universities today. We see an absence of the virtue of courage. Courage is not the absence of fear, of course. To not have fear would be a mark of insanity. Courage is the ability to live with fear and to live with stress and to live with opposition and to live with the unknown, to be able to endure the sort of goblins of your own mind and still act in the right way. Curling up in a university-sponsored cocoon and having a nice cup of cocoa and playing with some modeling clay so that you can chill out after a psychologically devastating election is not a sign of courage. That's a sign of cowardice. Now, like many people, I like learning and retelling stories about my family. And lately, I've been doing a fair amount of work on genealogy to sort of deepen that knowledge. And it struck me in the last 10 days as the events were unfolding. I was seeing so many people between the ages of 16 and 30 protesting in the strangest ways and over the strangest things. It struck me, this was quite odd when I reflected on what my ancestors were doing at that time of their life. Right? I'll share with you a little bit about my family, but I'm sure this is true of just about every person in this room who knows anything about their family. My father was a liberal arts student at Providence College in Rhode Island. And the year after he graduated, he got married. Very quickly, my mother conceived me. And about a month before I was born, my father landed in Vietnam as a Marine Corps officer. He was in Vietnam for a little over a year and then continued with the Marines shortly, or for a period afterwards. When he was in, those of you know a little bit about Vietnam, he arrived in Vietnam to take part in Con Thien and the siege of Khe Sanh and part of the Tet Offensive. He was awarded 2 Purple Hearts and a presidential citation for saving 150 men by placing himself in front of the enemy and calling in artillery so that people could retreat. Lots of people received the presidential citation. That's not an extremely rare award. Many people did that. He did it because he grew up in a family and went to a university where they were told communism was an evil against mankind and had to be opposed. And he took that seriously, and he went and he served in Vietnam. Both of my grandfathers served in the Pacific Theater. In looking around, I noticed lots of men and women that between the age of 15 and 30 do things that we now think only can happen in movies like The Revenant or some outrageous Hollywood movie. Right? I have 3 relatives who were at Gettysburg. They were all in the 16th Maine. The 16th Maine did what lots of units, every unit can tell a great story. Here's the story of the 16th Maine on day one at Gettysburg, which was a very bad day if you were from Maine, if you were on the side of the Union. Okay? South was doing a great job grinding up the Union to the north and west of the city of Gettysburg. And in particular, the forces from South Carolina almost completely overran that part and were about to outflank the Union. After about 7 hours of hard fighting, the 16th Maine was told to go into a defile where there was a rail line, because if the South Carolina troops could punch through, they would come around the flank, and the battle would have been over. Okay? The commanding officer, a man named Colonel James Tilden, simply received an order from his commander that said, "Occupy the position and hold at all costs." That's it. And he turned to the 250 men from Maine and he said, "You know what that means." So they went into this defile, and 38 came out 3 hours later. Everyone else was killed or captured. 16,000 men were able to retreat and escape. They did that because most of them, this astonishes us, most of them had a common liberal arts education. Most of them would have known at that moment, oh, this is going to end like Thermopylae or Horatius at the Bridge. They would have known these commonplace stories that you receive when you have a certain kind of education. They went in and they did their duty honorably, and they paid a terrible price for it. I am sure that many of us have stories like this about our families. Why is it that 16 to 30-year-olds today don't seem to be showing that kind of selflessness, that kind of behavior? I have no doubt that there are great 16 to 30-year-olds. I have no doubt that our media is portraying bad examples. But it's a determining number of bad examples, and it's growing, and we really need to think about this carefully as educators, as parents. So, what is wrong with what is commonly called Generation Snowflake? Is it that they dissent? Student dissent's been around a long time. If we want to figure out what's wrong with the students today and what's wrong with higher education and what's masquerading as the liberal arts today, we can ask the following question. What's the difference between rancid butter and Donald Trump? What's the difference between rancid butter and Donald Trump? I have to give you certain hooks so you can remember parts of this talk. The first student protest in the United States dates from 1766 at Harvard University. The students had for a very long time been dealing with awful food, including rancid butter. And in 1766, a student named Asia Dunbar, in the middle of dinner, said out loud, "Behold, our butter stinketh. Give us, therefore, butter that stinketh not." And half of the student body began to chant this with him, and they walked out. This is the first student protest in the United States. The president of Harvard convened a parliament, according to the sources, called the entire university together, and he asked for someone to come forward and confess who started, "Behold, our butter stinketh." Half of the student body all claimed communal responsibility. They wouldn't point out the individual. And so the president suspended half of Harvard that day. The suspended students then sent a delegate to the university parliament and asked to speak. The delegate said in his speech that the protest was not meant to be disrespectful. The protest was because the butter was bad and unwholesome. Of that, no one can deny. Had it been the first time, had it happened rarely, we should have been content. This, however, was not the case. That is to say, the student delegate of the protest established facts, had a sense of proportion, made reference to social norms, and expressed the reasonableness of his position and the position of the suspended students, all of whom accepted their suspension. The president looked in the matter, sided with the students, good butter was instituted, and the students were restored. Now, the students of this November, who are rioting and demonstrating and sustaining their efforts with funds outside of the university, have a very different approach. They have signs and slogans. The signs usually simply say such and such power, depending on the particular group that they most identify with, whether it's racial, gender orientation, or whatever. Sometimes the something power is one of the very words that the students were outraged that Mr. Trump used, because no good person could use word X. And then they're all holding signs that say X power. They need to take a course in dialectic or logic. Or they had slogans like, love trumps hate. No argumentation, simply assertions. We, the student body, hate Donald Trump because he represents hate. Calls for, which seem to have begun in the colleges, but now have gone up to the level of Mrs. Pelosi, calls for the destruction of the Electoral College since it is not popular. Now, protesting and dissent is not in itself a problem. As I said, we've had it since 1766 amongst students. The difference between 1766 and 2016 is there was a time when protesters used reasoned argument based on reality and true grievances. Now we base it on mob hysteria and psychological fragility. Students wish to dismantle the most stable constitution in the history of mankind, which they claim is not popular, because of a difference of 0.9% in the popular vote. Not exactly a landslide. And they're clearly traumatized or have convinced themselves they're traumatized over simply the loss of an election. We have had a collective temper tantrum among enormous portions of our undergraduates and graduate students, which mirrors what we see in our media and in our political life, unfortunately. Now, what Generation Snowflake lacks is more than I can say in one talk, but at the heart of it is any sense of a proper education. An education which would guide a young person towards responsible thinking or action. The norm of riot and dissent is a problem for our society. That's true, but a deeper problem is what's behind the riot and the dissent, and that is people who claim to have a liberal arts education are perhaps the dumbest people in our country right now. What has happened to our educational system? Now, contrary to what even I used to think about the liberal arts isn't, as people imagine it, some minor thing that some people study. If you go to college, odds are you're a liberal arts student these days. The number one degree in the United States today is business administration. That's true. About 300,000 people a year get a degree in business administration. The second degree, behind it by 7,000 roughly a year, is liberal arts. The third degree is a liberal arts degree, psychology. The fourth degree is general studies and liberal arts. And the vast majority of the top 50 degrees are things like English, history, liberal arts degrees. That's to say the vast majority of people in the country are actually liberal arts students. Why am I not happy? What is the problem? Problem is, obviously, the vast majority of liberal arts programs are liberal arts in name only. At least that's what I would contend. The vast majority of degree programs are not about what used to be called the liberal arts. They're about one simple thing. They're about me. They're about me. Here's a standard description from a local university, which I won't name, for what a liberal arts program is about. The liberal studies program gives you the opportunity to design your own curriculum that focuses on your own career goals and intellectual interests. The liberal studies program gives you the opportunity to design your own curriculum that focuses on your own career goals and intellectual interests. Note the repeated phrase, the only repeated phrase there. It's not truth, it's not experience, it's not wisdom. Your own is the expression repeated. There's no hierarchy, there's no goals, there's no craftsmanship, there's no sense of evaluation. There's just your interest. The intellect is just something of interest. And the clear thing in the hierarchy of goods there is your career goal. Now, take that expression and replace anything else. Imagine it didn't say liberal studies. For some reason, we're very comfortable with a description like that. And we think it's attractive. The liberal studies program gives you the opportunity to design your own curriculum that focuses on your own career goals and intellectual interests. Imagine if I said the engineering program gives you the opportunity to design your own curriculum that focuses on your own goals and interests. The medical program gives you the opportunity to design your own curriculum that focuses on your own goals and interests. So two things that deal with matter and the body. We laugh when liberal arts is not there and that's put in. We laugh at that, rightly. If I polled this room, I'm sure everyone in this room would say the soul and the intellect is far more important than matter and the body. But we find it perfectly acceptable to play this dangerous game where the liberal arts is understood as make it up. It's your own curriculum. It's your own interests. Follow your whim. Perfectly happy. Compare this attitude to the motto of one of the oldest colleges in our country, which remains to this day under 400. And this motto is in Latin, but it reveals what a true liberal arts education does. In Latin, since I know from dinner that for, 75 minutes a day, 4 days a week? So this will be easy. This is easy Latin. Facio liberos ex liberis, libris libraque. Facio liberos ex libris, libris libraque. I make free men, so this is the college speaking to those passing through the gates. I make free men out of children by means of books and balances. I make free men out of children by means of books and balances. This motto explicitly recognizes a few things that are no longer recognized in our approach to the liberal arts. Recognizes that a student, in fact, is not very mature and has no business making a decision about their interests, their passion, their major, their discipline. The old approach thought that was absurd. As absurd as every person in this room also thinks when I say engineering and medicine. But for some reason, culturally, we're very comfortable with Susie or Jimmy at 15, 16, or 17 going by themselves on a campus and determining their lifelong career. That wasn't the old approach to liberal arts. It explicitly acknowledged that teachers had vocations, and certain institutions were, as it were, in the business of handing down tradition. They were in the practice of cultivating wisdom, and those entering were still, in a way, children and needed formation and guidance. The goal was to form free men and women, free from the tyranny of opinion, free for the truth, explicitly stated. And the tools were books and balances. And in that lovely expression, libris libraque, books and balances, you have the entirety of the liberal arts. I'm sure those in association with Immaculata have heard of the trivium and the quadrivium. The trivium and the quadrivium. More fancy words that classics teachers use to tyrannize their students so that they can keep them in line. The trivium and the quadrivium. These traditional paths, the threefold path and the fourfold path to knowledge and wisdom. The trivium dealt with words. The quadrivium dealt with mathematics, books and balances. Now the trivium and the quadrivium are paths. Trivium, quadrivium, they're paths. Think about the image of a path. Someone who is a fool never establishes a path. They die. If you find a path through the forest, it wasn't established by the guy who got eaten. Right? There's wisdom in these old words. The path itself indicates this is a tried path to something good. In the trivium, grammar, logic, and rhetoric were emphasized. Essentially, the art of the memory and learning rules and traditions and stories, the art, that's grammar, dialectic, the art of ordering things rightly, and rhetoric, the art of building a community through words, of moving people to the right end. In the quadrivium, the arts, the path, the fourfold path, dealt with mathematics. In its original sense, mathematics was what could be known or learned outside of you. So the quadrivium dealt with arithmetic, the art of numbering things. Geometry dealt with the art of measuring things. Astronomy, the art of gazing at heavenly patterns. And music, the art of appreciating harmony, correspondence, and patterns well beyond us, and appreciating their beauty. Together, these 7 arts, blended, derived from, constitute all our liberal arts today. But those 7 are quite interesting. If you think about it, they're not simply some arcane subject matter. Grammar, dialectic, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, music. These actually represent the way all human beings learn. You begin by hearing stories, just hearing words, having things handed down to you. You then move to a sense of ordering things, understanding how they're arranged, being able to sort of manipulate the order and reorder things and understanding the principles of order. Every child goes through this pattern. You then move to using language yourself to move people to do something for you, to persuade them. Then as you get even older, you begin to appreciate things that are beyond what you want to do, the arrangements that you want or how you want to persuade. These higher level parts of the traditional liberal arts, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, music, are often incorrectly understood just as the sciences. They're not. They're about understanding that principles of the truth are not in your head. They really, truly exist. They can be demonstrated to others. There's something beyond you. Those 7 liberal arts help to make earlier generations very clear thinkers, to help them understand their own thoughts and desires and bring order to them. Now, almost all students go and they just get to make up the order for themselves. There's no coherent system like the 7 liberal arts at most institutions. The 7 liberal arts offer to students, and quite frankly to teachers, a unified tradition which had as its end or its fruits freedom, as I said before. And that freedom was a freedom to seek a happy life in conformity with the truth. Modern education, on the other hand, even when it calls itself the liberal arts, is really just a collection of financial resources so that aggregates of individuals can pursue, as the descriptions say, what interests them through a diversity of self-directed studies and experiment their way through $120,000 in 4 years of an education. And if the ends of that education are ever expressed, they are usually expressed with 2 words. The most common is success, and typically that means financial success. And the next one is power. In the traditional approach, the liberal arts approach, the person, the child, understood himself as created, placed in creation or nature, placed in political institutions, placed in a nation, placed in a religious community, and especially placed in a family. He understood himself in relationship to those things. His knowledge deepened his understanding of how those things worked and how he was going to sustain those things. Modern education is not an embedded individual. The modern false liberal arts education is an embattled individual. He's got to be liberated against nature. The whole transgendered phenomenon is part of the fight to liberate people from nature, from political institutions, from the church, and from the family. Because the goal is simply to provide as much space for the individual so he's not bothered by anything. There is a direct connection between the last 50 to 100 years of our university system and the ridiculous students sitting in cocoons with Play-Doh and crayons sipping cocoa. They, in fact, are correctly demonstrating what most parents are paying between $50,000 and $120,000 a year for. The goal is to produce someone well-tuned to sensitivity and disruption and figure out a way to form a defensive alliance with other individuals to create an increasingly larger and larger cocoon that will protect them from anything that might disturb their interests, their desires, their passions. And the cocoon has increasingly protected them from the family, the church, and ultimately all truth. That is the goal of modern education. The traditional liberal arts has been known to push men and women to think about the truth beyond themselves. Modern education pushes men and women to find ways of making everything conform to themselves and their desires. So now we come to this, move to a conclusion so that we can all have some wine and you can pelt me with questions. And I will show you that I'm liberally educated and I don't mind threatening ideas. I won't be traumatized. I will not ask for cocoa. Civilization, since my talk has this wonderful title about civilization being imperiled. Let's just talk briefly about civilization. Civilization can be described as having lots of different characteristics over the last 4,000 years across the globe. A balance between the wilderness, cultivated land, and settlement, whether we have big cities or small cities. A political order. The creation of and the sustaining of abundance that allows us to experience leisure, peace, learning, art, medicine, and especially some kind of spiritual center, some sort of liturgical or ritualistic life. In short, civilization is the successful creation and endurance of things beyond force, necessity, and immediate survival. The single most important factor in creating and maintaining a civilization is the ability of men and women to defer gratification and to defer or even completely give up on any self-centered use of power. And that ability must be habitual, not occasional. It must be habitual, at least amongst a large portion of the population, for civilization to be sustained. In short, civilization requires the constant institutional cultivation of moral and intellectual virtues. For almost 4,000 years, what we call the traditional liberal arts has been dedicated to training people in the cultivation of moral and intellectual virtues. Now, virtues require nature, habit, and reason. And we have some control of two of those three things. We have some control over habit and reason. But we live in a society where this is becoming a terrible problem to have virtue. Because we live in a society that rejects nature. Notice I haven't talked about our Lord. I haven't talked about God. Right? We're far beyond that. We live in a society that rejects any understanding of a consistent and ordered nature. Certainly a created nature. Our society has habits and encourages habits, but these habits tend to be those which reinforce the passions and the quest for success and power. So the radical nature of Generation Snowflake is very different than the generation of no rancid butter in 1765. It's very different than 1960s dissenters. The radicalism today is rooted in a new educational system, which on the surface produces exactly what you see: infantile hysteria in the face of ordinary setbacks. But we're risking everything in our social order right now. We're risking civilization itself if we don't recognize that this infantile behavior of the student protesters and their teachers and their administrators and many of our politicians is simply a manifestation of the very ancient and destructive power of the sin of pride. And if we do not recognize also in ourselves the inclination to act at times, just like Generation Snowflake, we're really in trouble. To seek power and success, to never follow the path of virtue, to never give thought to whether you're following the path of virtue, to never give over to joyful wonder in the face of truth. All that's going to end in disaster, but those things are the qualities of our educational system. So those of you who have been supporting or who have children at Immaculata, or if there's anyone here who's thinking about, is it worth it? Civilization depends upon Immaculata and other institutions like it. It's not about success. If you're thinking in terms of, should I give money to Immaculata? Should I send my children to Immaculata for their success? And the natural thought is entering into your head, success in terms of finance and connections and networking and jobs. Don't obliterate that thought, but realize that's very much secondary to what's really important and what's really at stake right now, and that is our whole civilization. It is critical that a place like Immaculata, and there are other, thank God, there are other institutions like Immaculata throughout the country. It's critical that places that offer the traditional liberal arts flourish. And I think from what little I know of the history of the school over the last few years, as people get to know the school, you're seeing the enrollment tick up. Because even though we live in a society where the rules and the institutions are often bent and broken, no one has figured out a way yet of completely destroying human nature and destroying certain things that were placed in our hearts and constitute our mind. When humans are placed before the truth, they react. If they're pure and ready and curious in a natural way, they react by moving towards the truth. They're hungry for it. If they're a little bit further along in life and they've been corrupted and have bad habits, they react by going into a cocoon and asking for hot chocolate. So in fact, I view the cocoons, the Play-Doh, the coloring books and all that is a healthy sign, because it's a sign that people are reacting to the power of the truth. So now, more than ever, Civilization needs the liberal arts and institutions that can articulate and provide a liberal arts education. So I'm very happy to have said a few words, and I'd be happier, rather than speechifying, to chat or answer questions. So thank you very much. Do you want me to take questions? Should we allow people to drink? Yes.
Well, you placed liberal arts education within this order of nature and created nature. I'm curious, do you see any efforts on a secular level to try and reclaim some sense of normalcy or sanity when it comes to all of this? Are there any thinkers that are trying to reclaim this idea of the natural order that are not explicitly Christian, or that
Sure.
must be tied explicitly to Christianity?
Sure. I actually think certainly the older generation, and perhaps it's still the vast majority of scientists, period, right, who don't want to be put in jail, teach reality, right? Forget theism, as you say. A good scientist, if he's approaching his field without the lenses of ideology, is going to see consistency and patterns. Science doesn't work without those things, in fact. You couldn't go from semester to semester if, in fact, if there wasn't a reality that was stable, if there wasn't truth. The problem, as I see it, is people are increasingly being corrupted to use those things for false ends. So the whole thrust, so to answer your question, yes. I actually think that many people in the sciences are very noble, even those who don't have particularly strong religious beliefs. They're looking at the universe and they're seeing stable, orderly things that are empirical, can be observed, recorded, experiments which can be repeated. They have a rigorous disciplinary approach to reality. The problem is when science is hijacked, as it has been for on and off throughout history, but in particular right now we're experiencing a rather brutal hijack of science through STEM, which is nothing but ideology. It has nothing to do with science, nothing to do with research. It's entirely about social engineering and politics.
Excuse me, can you explain that?
Sure.
All the high school kids are encouraged to take STEM classes? You say
By
it's
whom,
not really
yeah, I'd be happy to talk about STEM. Who's encouraging them to take STEM courses and why?
administrators
And who's encouraging them? The government. There are two principal influences behind STEM. The government, especially, it's been a cornerstone of the Obama administration's educational policy. Microsoft. Huge amounts of money for Microsoft and a handful of other software corporations. Right. Collectively, as a nation, we spend about $4 million a year on STEM. How are the test scores looking over the last 10 years of STEM? They've gone down. One of the reasons that we were told we needed to engage in STEM was, and this has been going on and off since the Second World War, that we're falling behind other nations in our competitiveness, our scientific research, and our defensive capacities. And that Americans rank something like in the middle, the top third, or the bottom of the top third to the middle in testing scores compared to other industrial nations. It's the principal argument. So we need more STEM. We need more people with STEM degrees in order to face the deficit of STEM jobs and to make the nation more competitive. Ever since they've been running these tests, America has been in the middle. There's been no movement. America has not declined in its testing scores. Anyone who knows anything about statistics 101 knows that if you have a number of sample groups that you're running statistics on, you can't merely rank them. You have to be comparing apples to apples. We can't compare ourselves, for example, to Taiwan. If you have a small population where you have a very narrow, privileged group of people going through a educational system that's all controlled and geared to taking tests, how will they score? Extremely high. So the averages for small countries are going to be extremely high. If you have a huge nation that still emphasizes general education, where are the scores going to be? They're going to average out in the middle. Our scores haven't moved. We've been told they're declining. They haven't. There's no evidence of that. My favorite one is that we need more STEM positions, right? In our economy, where there's been ups and downs, the one major that has been, or the major that has been most stagnant in terms of employability and income have been the majors associated with STEM. Over 10 years, it's the one, those majors have actually declined compared to all other majors, including being a Latin teacher. There is no empirical evidence for anything that was told us about STEM, and if you begin to scratch and search, what you find is STEM is advanced by the state, and it's well, if you were a large industry that wanted to create a situation where you could cherry pick the best who are fiercely competing and keep wages down with everyone else, what would you do? You would try to create a market where you flooded the employee pool with more people than you needed, and you made it very aggressive with government awards for the very, very best. That's what's going on in STEM. People who get STEM degrees have a much harder time moving throughout their career, and there are fewer jobs for them. That's in the last 2 years, STEM has been crushed for anyone who wants to actually be scientific and empirical and look at the evidence. Anyone who's interested can email me, and I'll send you, a bibliography on STEM. STEM is a great tragedy in part because of the promise. We worked in as we always did. We're going to help minorities, no help, and because of the fantastic expense. $4 billion a year that we spend on STEM, on just STEM programs. I'm not talking about science, just STEM programs that we're sponsoring and subsidizing.
You obliquely mentioned costs insofar as how much people are paying. And I think that the cost of education and the need for that competitive edge that you just mentioned in regards to STEM seems to me to carry a lot of weight in this as well, because if you're going to go into debt for your education, you're going to pay $120,000 for your education, then you're going to be able to want to make more demands of the school. I'm paying for this. I'm paying $120,000 for this. I want blank, or I want to be able to get a degree, or I want to expand that cocoon beyond just the chocolate and the cookies. I want to be able to expand that cocoon so that I can control my life and not interact with people I don't want to interact with. Live the way I want, do the way I want, not have to mess with the people I don't want to mess with.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me like the cost of education, the emphasis that it's become a consumer product, has to play a lot in this process.
Yes, and we have to recognize that we're in some respects blessed in having this incredible economic system that generates wealth and it helps rationalize transactions, etc. But along with that, we have, I don't want to say it's necessary, but we've allowed the strength of our market economy and the way we think about the economy to commodify everything. And so we understand education, it's almost become instinctual that we think of it in terms of what's the cost, what's the benefit financially. We don't think about the other side. And ironically, I don't find that most Americans are very clear in their financial thinking about universities. So everyone has heard, because President Obama has told us, that universities are outrageously expensive, and they're charging all this money, and they're not being transparent. I mean, this is again, this drum has been beat for 8 years. By the way, not many people listen carefully because the solution was always, therefore we need free education for all, and free education meant state education for all. The two bad private universities charging too much always had the solution of good free state universities, free meaning our tax money, right? But even if you look at the finances of universities, is University of Louisville the largest university, I'm assuming, in this area? Yeah, so I've never been to the University of Louisville. I'm sure there are good people at the University of Louisville, and I'm not just saying that. I'm sure there are good people. I'm sure the vast majority of people get up in the morning and they go to work at the University of Louisville and they want to do good in the world. Let's look at the finances of a place like the University of Louisville. What percentage of state money is pouring into it? How are they allocating the money? What are the size of the dormitories? What are the size of the student unions? What are we actually paying for? Have you ever? It's fascinating to see an itemization of what someone's tuition actually is paying for. It's not principally paying the salaries of the teachers of the students. It's paying the other things. And if you're talking about the big private universities, that's even stranger. I'm not sure why our Ivy League universities aren't free for all. They should just outpace the state. They have no need to charge tuition. If you looked at the economic or financial activity of a place like Harvard University, now granted, not many universities are in this status, but Harvard University, the financial activity supporting a thing called a university, what we would think of as a university, libraries, salaries, classes, that's minor. The majority of the activity for Harvard University is the same as a gigantic brokerage company. They have so much money, they're just moving it around, investing in it, making more money. Why on earth are they charging anyone tuition? So there is something wrong with our system where you have some universities who don't need the money charging an astronomical amount of money. Other universities that don't have those levels of endowments continuing to build things that don't have anything to do with education. And the general public has reduced education to what's its financial kickback for me when I pay this amount of money for my son or daughter? What are they going to make? Not thinking about what's the shape of their soul or their character. It's a funny thing, higher education. Yeah. Father.
You jumped from rancid butter to cocoa. Can you talk a little bit about the history of the decline and who's behind it or what's behind it?
Sure. So the American Academy was fairly stable in what it offered and in the sizes of most universities until just before the First World War was when things began to change. Now, the enrollment at most colleges and universities was going up, but it was still what we would consider very small, the average college size. The big change occurred at Harvard with the introduction of the elective system under the president of Harvard, President Eliot. And the national fight was between the Catholics and Harvard University. President George Bull, who was the president of Boston, took on publicly the president of Harvard on whether undergraduates would be better met by offering them a set curriculum, which was the tradition and which is what the Catholic institutions upheld principally until about the 1960s, or what President Eliot was suggesting, which is what is commonplace now. The student comes in, takes what he wants, driven by his passions and interests. So that is the most significant intellectual shift, a shift to simply choosing to create your own education rather than working within the tradition. There are other economic factors, the GI Bill that ballooned the size of universities after the Second World War. But the biggest change was moving away from a common curriculum to this idea that the students can discern their own best interests. That's the shift. And it seems to, I haven't traced this out in a careful genealogical way, but it certainly seems to be part of the increasing hostility of those within the universities to tradition and families. Because it follows, if you're going to say the 16-year-old should choose his own education, that you should also say the parents should have nothing to do with what the 16-year-old is doing at college. So the big social shift in the 50s and 60s, into the 70s, was the college no longer allowing there to be a connection between the parents and the students, i.e., unless you get a student to fill out a form, it's illegal to send grades home to parents. Oddly, it's not illegal to send the bill home. I never understood how any of this was passed into law, right? We're allowed to charge parents, but we're not allowed, unless the student signs a form, we're not allowed to say what the grades are, whether they have a social problem, even if they're ill. They have to be gravely ill before you can legally contact parents. That's a gigantic shift. And it is a strike against authority and tradition that's launched within the universities. Yes?
If you don't want to say anything, that's fine. I'm just curious, on a different level, on a spiritual level, I guess, is there, I'll use the word carefully, conspiracy? Intent, malevolent intent? What's the outcome of that malevolence? What's the purpose of it? If it does exist. Otherwise, it's just a blind leading the blind down some random path. Some people ended up winning an argument, so now they have electors. Rather than keeping the older tradition, there must have been a reason for creating a society of snowflakes.
Sure. Well, the problem with conspiracies is even when they're true, they're usually linked to other conspiracies, and so where are we going to start? Or rather, moving in the other direction, where are we going to end? So again, as I said, the fight was between Harvard, which had been a Protestant university and had gone the natural trajectory of a Protestant university, and Boston College. That's an old fight. So do I want to trace that to the Reformation and say something in the Protestant American character has long said, I'll do it my way, damn to tradition and to authority. But I don't want to lay the blame on the Protestants because we can trace that back to the Gnostics and we can keep going back. And that's why in my talk I said, ultimately we have to locate these problems in pride and the fall. So there's a conspiracy and there's a malevolent attack, of course. Let's go hyper-spiritual. The last thing that Satan wants is for people to be loving, to believe that there's an ordered nature, a creator that ordered that nature, that man has a purpose. That purpose is to work towards human solidarity and the glorification of God while they're alive, and end happy by accepting their nature and moving into eternity with God. And there's been a long-standing conspiracy to confuse mankind on that issue. If your best thinkers are coming from certain sources and you're a fallen angel, you're not going to waste your time fighting a peripheral battle. You go after those centers of learning, hospitality, and leadership. But it's not that the university is the only thing being attacked by dark forces. The church is being attacked, the military, I mean, you name it. Anything that stands for tradition, order, the truth, nobility, that's going to be attacked. But I'm not sure where to stop the conspiracy. I think we just stop it with the fall. It's pride. There's something in the fallen human that wants power for himself, that fools himself that he can be the one that uses power correctly. That's how it begins. And then we begin to go down the path, and it's mine. It's mine, my power. I don't know if you had, it sounded like you had something in mind. Maybe over a glass of wine we can swap conspiracy stories. Yes.
Where do you draw the line between allowing students the freedom to a calculated self-direction, calculated judgment about what courses will serve their agenda in life, and what you call the passions and mere interests, as they allowed to do whatever they want?
Well, can you just give me a little bit more on what you mean? Where do I draw the line? I'm not.
You're saying that education became I guess, a passive sort of thing, where students, according to their passions, get to choose whatever makes them feel good in the moment. Why is it not a more generous interpretation that we're allowing students to make a calculated judgment about what course will serve their needs in life? And I understand the agenda of giving them a full education, but there also will be students who would choose the economic version of that. Is it inherently evil to allow them that discretion?
No, they eventually must face that moment, right? That is inevitable. My view on the matter is that that moment is on the professional level or on graduate school for where we are in history. For where we are in history. That's to say, and I'm a person who's dedicated his life to high school and college education. In the 1870s, I think 14 and 15-year-olds had a lot more good formation and sense, and they could make decisions that 30-year-olds are troubled by today. And that the reality is that we need to keep, in my view, the undergraduate education general and unified to serve people well. We still need engineers and doctors, et cetera. Right? I'm not arguing against any of those things. But given the increasing longevity of man, given the dynamic nature, as it's described, of our economy, we're, without reason or reflection, we're putting a burden on people that are not prepared to make the decisions that they are asked to make in the first week of arriving at university. Again, you can turn the calendar back, and young people would have been. And some young people quite possibly could be able to now. Except here's the problem. It's very difficult, even if you have had high school formation that's excellent, if you had a broad, strong liberal arts education, to then go into such incredibly hostile territory that is the modern university. Education is not supposed to be combat on the day-to-day moral level. You're supposed to be able to spar on the level of ideas, but you're not supposed to face evil indoctrination in the dormitories. And that is the principal threat, I think, for most people, even with a decent high school formation, is they're blithely walking onto campus and they and their parents have no idea, absolutely no idea what is really going on and what's been going on for 10 or 15 years. No idea. We're in a mixed audience, otherwise I would be very explicit. Yeah.
I think one of the things that's been disturbing to me that I've experienced is the number of protests that are happening in high schools and even middle schools.
Increasingly.
These are kids who can't even vote, yet they're protesting the outcome of the election. So can you comment on where this is starting and the role of, I mean, as a parent, I would be like, no, get your butt back in class. But, you know, there's obviously some parental deficits here as well as in the educational system. Can you maybe comment on the age at which we're seeing these attitudes and cocoons developing?
Well, we're seeing it from the moment they step foot on school property, right? If you look at the language that's being put in effect regarding laws on transgendered counseling, they're pushing that as young as possible. So in the school system, there's been a tremendous effort to define what is and isn't human nature and human behavior for a long time. Where is it coming from? It's coming from some people in government, some people in the educational system. They tend to be of the same ilk politically. They tend to be people who have a very non-traditional lifestyle or who are simply too weak to recognize that there's a natural law and a natural order, and people who work against nature come to a bad end. In this life, they come to a bad end. They're not happy. So, I mean, we can go, I'm not sure where Father went. We could really go crazy on the conspiracy theory there. But it is, your observation is correct. It's creeping down. I read this morning, the San Francisco School District has designed a post-election curriculum to teach all the way down to the 3rd grade that we need not accept the results of this election, that the President of the United States is a bad man, and he represents list of isms. I mean, I'm trying to think of what my son Ben would make of this. He wouldn't even understand half those words. But it's been adopted by the San Francisco Public School District. It's not required, so they're saying you don't have to do this, but it is adopted as an official curriculum that you can use. So. Yes?
So to go back to the human story, would you explain what John Dewey had to do with the lawful in American education? Is that too?
I would prefer not to. I don't, it's been a long time since I read Dewey, right? And I would be speaking in generalizations, and that would be unfair to Mr. Dewey. But boy, he messed it up.
All right, well, let's give Dr. Fahey a round of applause.